Hey, welcome back everybody. Today we are going to talk about watercolor supplies. I'm going to talk about 3 important things that I use every time that I paint. And it's not paint and it's not brushes. So let's take a look. Here is a look at my paint box. So this paint box sits right next to my palette. I'll quickly give you an overview of what I keep in here, and then we'll get into the 3 important items that I can't do without. So obviously, if I'm painting, I need my paint brushes. So I have a little area over here where I keep all my brushes, keep some smaller brushes over here. I have a section here where I keep a little bit of gouache for small highlights in my scene. Then I have my pencil that I use for my drawing, some extra lead for that. And then we get to important item number 1, which is my palette knife. So if you're using thick paint in a scene, say you're painting some trees, some bushes, things like that, and you want to add a little bit more detail, if you've used some thick paint, you can take a palette knife and you can scrape some highlights into a tree or whatever it is that you're trying to paint. Now, you don't want to be too aggressive and scratch into your paper and damage your paper. And if you scratch too early when you're painting, you're not going to be able to see the little highlight. You'll just put a divot in your paper and your wash will settle into that divot and it creates a not so attractive mark on your paper. So you want to make sure that the first thing is you're using thick paint in this area. You don't want to scratch on a delicate wash, on a thin wash on your paper, because it's just not going to look good. So you want to wait until your paint, it's still wet, but it's not dry. So kind of in that damp stage, that's when you can take a palette knife. You could even use your fingernail, or I've seen people use a credit card for this, and you can scrape in and get a subtle little value change in an area. You can add some more texture to an area, and it's a nice tool to break up the monotony in some of the boring parts of your painting. Now, a couple things I like to use this for is if I have power lines in the scene. So if I painted a thin little power line and it goes across a dark area, I can scratch in a little highlight, and with this palette knife, you can get a nice little precise point that you can't really get if you're using your fingernail or a credit card or something like that. Now, another thing I like to use this for is creating directional lines in my scene. So if I painted a shadow shape in the foreground of my scene, and there's some directional lines on a road that kind of lead into my scene, some marks on the road, this is great for those small little lines. And you can scrape right through that wash to keep the viewer's eye moving into your scene and around your painting. So if you haven't tried this before, experiment with a palette knife and let me know what you think about it. Okay, let's go back to my paint box and look at item number 2. Item number 2 is a natural sponge. So you may have seen my video where I talk about how I don't like to tape my paper down. And the reason is I like to wet down both sides of my paper. That gives me more time to paint wet into wet and to lay a good foundation that I'm going to build upon for the rest of my painting. And I like to use a natural sponge rather than an artificial sponge because I don't know what kind of additives, what kind of fillers, and I don't know what it's doing to my paper, what it's putting onto my paper. So to be safe, I like to use a natural sponge. So the reason I like to use a sponge rather than a paintbrush when I'm wetting down my paper is I feel like I have more control. You can get your sponge wet, you can squeeze out most of the water, and you can just dampen the back side of your paper and then dampen the front side of your paper. Now, if you get too much water on your paper, that's why this sponge is handy. You can squeeze it out and you can take off the excess water. You don't need your paper to be sopping wet. You just want to get the whole thing nice and evenly damp. All right, back to my paint box. Important item number 3 is my spray bottle. And there's a few things that I use it for. The first thing is a simple practical thing. If I paint on my surface and I get paint dried up here, like this type of paint on my surface, I can spray this down and I can clear off my painting area before I get started to ensure that I'm not getting any paint on my wet paper when I lay it down on my surface. But I think the most important thing I use this spray bottle for is wetting down my paint before I get started. If you're like me, sometimes you crack open your palette, you take a look and you have these dried clumps of paint in each well. Now, before you get started painting, you're gonna wanna bring your paint back to life before you use it. And so by spraying all my paint down before I start and letting it set for about 10 minutes or so, the paint is then activated and ready to use. And this is important because when I go in to start mixing, if I'm having a hard time getting enough paint out of my well, then my values are going to be weak. I'm going to be frustrated with this. So in a sense, this is one of the most important tools I can have because it's activating my paint, allowing me to mix easier to get to the correct values that I need for my painting. As you know, if you've seen many of my videos, values are the thing I talk about all the time. If my values are off, then my painting doesn't work. Those are my 3 essential items in my paint box. So I have my palette knife, I have a sponge, and I have a water bottle. If you have more questions about watercolor supplies, take a look at my Watercolor Essentials Supplies Guide. When you first get started, figuring out supplies is overwhelming. There's so many options. There's a lot out there. I go through what brushes I use, what pigments I use, and talk about my paper and supplies. You can follow the link down below, or you can follow the link in my Instagram bio. Check out my free gift for you. All right, guys, thank you for spending some time with me this week once again. Keep working, keep moving forward in your watercolor learning, and I'll see you next time.